I'm Renee Cummings, and it is such an honor and a pleasure to be with you at AI Expo Africa 2020. I'm a criminologist, a criminal psychologist, and an AI ethicist. As a criminologist, my focus is on lawmaking, law breaking, and law enforcing. As a criminal psychologist, I focus on the mind of the perpetrator, the foreground and background factors that are involved in the commissioning of a crime, the things that motivate an individual to perpetrate a crime. As an AI ethicist, my focus is not as a philosopher, but as someone who is deeply interested in operationalizing ethics, making ethics actionable, making ethics part of the solution, making ethics part of the process from the design, development, and deployment of an AI solution. So all of these things really come together nicely for me because most of my work is at the intersection of artificial intelligence and criminal justice, as well as work within the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how ethics must create that really robust and rigorous guardrail for us to move forward with emerging technologies. Arrested by AI, we're going to have a critical conversation. I like critical conversations because I believe the conversations change lives. I'm also a critical criminologist, so critical thinking is what I bring to the space. Arrested by AI, let's think about that. Algorithms, algorithmic decision-making systems, AI-infused systems are now given the authority to make an arrest. That's something we have got to think about. And in this narrative, in this conversation that we're having, I want you to think about two plots: mistaken match or mistaken identity and mass surveillance. And how do these two work together? And then there are several themes that I also want you to think about: race, bias, secrecy, privacy, power, freedom. And I'm going to say it again: race, bias, secrecy, privacy, power, and freedom. And how AI informs all of these within the context of the criminal justice system. Ripped right out of the headlines are these two. Wrongful arrest: a Detroit man by the name of Robert Williams arrested because of facial recognition, and the entire concept in this piece, which is taken off of the American Civil Liberties Union website and was released by the ACLU, looks at the fact that facial recognition is inaccurate, unreliable, and cannot tell Black people apart. And this is not news because there have been scholars who have been speaking about this for quite some time. Now we're ripping this one off of the headlines, just happened and released a few days ago, which looks at unlawful use. And this case was brought to the court by Ed Bridges, who felt that he was captured unlawfully on a public street in Cardiff. Now, these two are very powerful because if AI is being used to arrest someone, what are the laws behind that? How reliable is that technology? And what happens, as we're seeing now, in cases where somebody was wrongfully arrested or the technology was used unlawfully against someone? AI justice. And we've been seeing this more and more. So as a criminologist, as someone who has worked with law enforcement internationally, and someone who has trained law enforcement internationally, I understand the need for efficiency and effectiveness and expediency within the context of policing and sentencing and any system that deals with criminal justice, because justice must be real time. Police officers want to be on the spot in time to ensure that crime is prevented. So much of crime prevention, much of the criminal justice processes and procedures are finding a particular level of comfort with algorithmic decision-making systems, predictive analytics in policing, giving us predictive policing, data-driven justice, very popular. The criminal justice system seems to be falling in love with it. Evidence-based criminology, evidence-based criminology, criminal justice. We are seeing this more and more because what we want to know is that when it comes to criminal justice, we are making informed decisions. Very, very important. Those informed decisions are being made in real time, because what we want is a response from the police, a response from the criminal justice system that's also in real time. And this brings us to intelligence-led policing. It's something that we've been hearing for quite some time, and something we would say that many police agencies internationally have bought into. And this intelligence-led policing is what we are seeing in cities like Los Angeles or New York or Atlanta, major cities in the UK. We're seeing it in London. We're just seeing it in major cities. In New York in particular, the NYPD is now using a more sophisticated and a more savvy form of intelligence-led police, which is called precision policing. In the court system, we are seeing those algorithmic decision-making systems being used to decide on things like sentencing and risk assessment tools within the judicial system, within the correction system, all of these things working together to bring AI justice. We're also seeing it in the court system, and we're seeing that, in countries like China, who have been much more aggressive with using the technology, really being very imaginative when it comes in the ways in which justice could be administered using algorithms. But then I ask you, is it AI justice or is it AI injustice? And that is something that we have got to think about moving forward as a community of practitioners working within the field of AI, and as a society leaning more and more on AI to deliver justice. And we're seeing this more and more in the US because we're hearing those calls of defunding the police. And we know that because there are calls to defund the police are looking for more imaginative, definitely more creative ways to do policing. So they are leaning on technology to come up with those solutions, what we call techno-solutionism, because what the police would like to show is that we are using technology, we are using science, we are using data, so our decisions are not biased, our decisions are not based on discriminatory tactics, our decisions are not based on systemic racism, but based on data. But that's something that you've got to think about, and we've got to move into that conversation just in a little bit. Predictive policing, big data policing. We are seeing some of the challenges with those systems already, and we are seeing the pushback by many cities when it comes to predictive policing, when it comes to big data policing, and how data is being used against particular communities. Sentencing, pretrial detention, bail, incarceration, all of these being impacted by algorithmic decision systems, and many of decisions not being the kinds of decisions we were hoping for, either discriminating against individuals or communities based on race. Corrections, offender management, parole, all of these being impacted seriously by algorithms. And of course, what the criminal justice is saying, particularly when it comes to sentencing, is that these risk assessment tools are helping us decide who is going to reoffend. So because we want to keep the recidivism rate down, we are saying that these tools are really supporting that, looking at who's going to reoffend, ensuring that public safety and quality of life are really on the front burner when we're coming to criminal justice. But again, I will ask you that question. Is it AI justice or is it AI injustice? As we move forward more into policing by algorithms, we've got to think about the use of big data in policing. And we've got to think about predictive policing and whether or not the data sets, the data that's being used to design and develop these policies, whether or not that data is reliable. We know that facial recognition is not reliable, and we know that there's been extraordinary pushback, and we know we have got to, as much as we can, ban that technology until we really understand it. That is, if we want to understand it to that regard, because many of the experts, the scholars, the individuals who are behind that technology have already pushed back on it. We know of the body cameras, we know of the ring cameras and the neighborhood apps, and the fact that we're seeing now that the Internet of Things is now the internet of evidence when it comes to getting evidence in many cases, including homicide and domestic violence. Very important to think about. And we know the smartphone is connected to the smart homes, also connected to the smart cars, and creating that interconnectedness which law enforcement could access. And we've been seeing the geofence and geolocation warrants and the digital search warrants. And we are seeing what I call the AI detectives and undercover AI and covert operations because of AI. And why is that? Because law enforcement now has the ability to use video analytics, social network analysis, sensor technologies, and the interconnectedness of these technologies have turned an algorithm into an undercover agent. And these covert operations, because of the fact that the public is unaware where the technologies are located in the communities and the lethality of these technologies when it comes to the amount of digital force in play, what we are seeing is a new type of policing that we've got to really think about critically. When it comes to technology, you've got to think about bias, discrimination, and policing. And this is what we are seeing with the algorithms. They're being used disproportionately in communities of color. People of color are at higher risk for wrongful arrest. The laws that are used to govern the untargeted access to the data by the police are very anemic. And of course, the use of technology by law enforcement without the requisite checks and balances have the potential for extraordinary abuse. We're seeing that individual rights can be eroded with relative ease, and what this is doing is within the context of police discretion, it is really expanding police powers. AI policing. Police requests for Google users' location histories have grown 1,500% between 2017 and 2018. And an additional 500% from 2018 to 2019. And given Black Lives Movement in the United States, and given the protest action that we have seen across the world, and given those calls to defund the police, we know that that percentage has probably doubled or tripled between 2019 and 2020, with police requesting from Google location histories of users. Digital profiling. And we are seeing digital profiling more and more as predictive policing systems disproportionately target street crimes instead of crime in the streets. So we're not seeing predictive analytics tools being designed in real time to deal with white-collar crime. We're seeing it designed, again, to deal with crime in the streets, in our marginalized, vulnerable, underserved, and disinvested communities. And why is that? Because our AI imagination has been operating in a very traditionalist way. And that traditionalist approach of training classification models continue to use geospatial features and historical crime data, which we know has a history of systemic racism. Without explicit consent, how is big data and AI policing allowed to use our information, our data, without us consenting to the use? And what we're seeing right now is that any company that stores users' granular location histories could be approached by law enforcement to acquire that data. in a form of a digital subpoena or a warrant, a geolocation or geofencing warrant. And that could be any company. How about fitness tracker data? How about your rideshare apps, your healthcare apps, your contact tracing apps? Those are things that you want to think about. And just to drill a little more into facial recognition, we know that many cases have shown that the police do not have to report when they use facial recognition. We know it's racially biased against dark-skinned individuals and women. We know it's less accurate for African Americans, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. We know it's unreliable at best. We know that IBM has already discontinued its development of the technology. We know that Amazon and Microsoft have put a moratorium on that. And we also know that the UK court, we spoke about that, ruled that the police use violates human rights. So why are we still excited about this technology? Why do we want to use this technology? But we've got to ask ourselves that question. It's already been banned from many cities: San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Boston, Somerville, Brookline, Cambridge, and many more cities are banning the use of this technology because it's inaccurate, it's unreliable, it's biased, it discriminates, and it is not the kind of technology we want to be used without public understanding, without public engagement, without public involvement. And because we can't have that within the context of law enforcement, what we are saying is that this technology must be discontinued. Arraignment by algorithms. And within the sentencing process, we have seen these risk scores that are supposed to qualify the likelihood that a person will commit a crime. We've seen the risk assessment tools, the algorithmic decision-making systems, but we've seen more and more opaque algorithms frustrating due process and reinforcing digital disparities. And of course, those zombie predictions that systematically overestimate the risks of reoffending. And of course, there's black data, and black data matters, and I want you to know that. And what we are seeing with black data and what we are asking is, when it comes to coding, are we color coding when we're designing some of these risk assessment tools? The right to challenge an algorithm, and this is very, very important. In this case, in the American criminal justice system, in the correction system, Glenn Rodriguez did a documentary on how he won his freedom after being denied parole by a biased algorithm. And I want us to listen to this. Now, we couldn't get more clear than that. The right to challenge the evidence and the fact that we're seeing more and more individuals incarcerated now challenging those algorithms that have put them behind bars. So those algorithms that are denying them parole. And we've got to think more and more and more about that. Algorithms rewriting the rules of justice, changing the way justice is administered, codifying unconscious bias, systemic racism, algorithms that inherit prejudices of prior decision makers. We've got to reflect on those widespread biases that persist in society at large. And we've got to think about those pre-existing patterns of exclusion and inequality that are part of those algorithms. Data-based discrimination is something for us to think about, particularly as data scientists, which I am not, but definitely someone who considers herself a data activist, but for law enforcement to also think about these tools that we are using. And any kind of unthinking reliance on data can deny historically disadvantaged and vulnerable groups full participation in society, can lead to measurable biases and risk scores and outcome measures because data is from a racially biased criminal justice system, in particular the United States, which is the case that we're looking at. The power and privilege in data collection, and to understand that the decision to create a research question, or the decision to collect data, or the decision as to where, when, why, and how to collect data are all power plays, are all privileged decisions. And those foundational issues of collection and standardization impact the data. And that is why data-based discrimination is so critical to the conversation of arrested by AI, as well as that conversation of AI justice or AI injustice. What we are seeing are new challenges and new risks for vulnerable communities. And more because of that lack of confidence and that lack of trust, and sometimes that lack of legitimacy in the law enforcement process, what law enforcement needs to do is build trust and build confidence and ensure that there is a belief in the legitimacy of the work it is doing. And how could that be done if these algorithms are now really looking at introducing new risks into the system? So you've got to think about how systemic racism operates in algorithms, the hidden biases in data that algorithms possess as they learn patterns, data amplifying historical and institutional discrimination, racialized predictions, social and political factors that continue to inform digital technology and to fold discrimination in the design process, and the many things that slip in through the back door of design optimization. And sociologist and scholar Ruha Benjamin out of Princeton University deals with that so well in her book, Race for Technology, and it's definitely a text that I think everyone thinking about data and bias needs to read. Outsourcing criminal justice decisions. Now we know that the whole decision to bring those algorithms into the criminal justice system is because of expediency. But we've got to look at our priorities, and we cannot prioritize efficiency or expediency over equity, because it comes down to public trust, public confidence, police legitimacy, and that question of legal cynicism, and whether or not our communities actually believe the police are there to protect them and that justice will be served in real time. So when it comes to outsourcing criminal justice systems, criminal justice decisions to algorithmic decision-making systems, we've got to think about life and liberty, and we've got to think about those high-stakes decisions. And if it is that we are really prepared to allow algorithms to make those decisions. And this is what I call color coding. And it's just a flip on coding and whether or not the color that we're using is the color that defines people's skin tones. Because what we have been seeing, particularly with predictive policing, particularly with big data policing and algorithms that are trying to make arrests, are that the proxies for race that slip into these classifications are the ones that really undermine the decision-making systems, because many of those proxies for race would include things like criminal history, financial history, employment history, and neighborhood characteristics. And we've got to think about that. And the hidden effects of algorithms. We cannot continue to say that algorithms are neutral or they are objective because they are science and because they are math, because we know that is not true. Because we have seen the racial disparities and economic disparities, re-victimization, marginalization, new types of systemic discrimination, and several levels of discrimination hidden into those algorithms as they do policing, as they do sentencing, as they do corrections, as they try to predict recidivism, as they try to ensure public safety. And we've got to think about that. Algorithms must be interrogated. We've got to interrogate them Do they make things fairer? Or do they repeat our past practices and patterns that could be biased and discriminatory? Do they automate the status quo? Or are we codifying bias and bigotry? The algorithm did it. We hear that all the time. It's because of the algorithm, or the algorithm came up with that score. We can't do that. People need to get explanations and justifications, and there must be context to those algorithmic decisions. So we've got to always think about transparency, accountability, responsibility, explainability, accuracy, auditability, and fairness. Those things are critical to the process and must be thought about. And when we think about the black box, it's very, very important because we heard Glenn Rodriguez saying that he challenged the algorithmic decision-making system for his freedom. And we've got to look at that data calculation process. And we've got to ensure that the laws that apply to human decisions can be effectively applied to algorithmic decisions, because predictions must specify the process by which decisions are reached. The public has a right to know. Yes, there's that concept of the trade secret and that concept of intellectual property and proprietary rights, but we've got to always think about algorithmic accountability. We've got to ensure those impact assessments are done regularly on those algorithms. We've got to think about trust, human rights, civil liberties, public safety, economic equity, political and proprietary and business concerns sadly take priority. But AI ethics is here to change that. And as individuals working within the realm of AI, we have got to look at those things. What I ask for you to do is be data conscious. If you're using data, have proper justification, ensure due diligence, due process, duty of care. If there's a sunset clause that needs to be in there, but also ensure civil rights and human rights are always lifted up. What is required at this stage is ethical stewardship. And it's not a trade-off between ethics and innovation. Ethics will not stifle innovation. It can certainly and must always match the pace of innovation. We've got to see ethics integrated into the design, development, and deployment life cycles of AI. We've got to ensure that our programs, processes, procedures, policies, and products are ethical. We've got to ensure, and encourage informed public debate and how benefits are going to be distributed by this technology as we look at the long-term sociological benefits or the long-term negative impacts of this technology. And we've got to have open conversations on the implications and how society should respond. And I am here to ask you, what kind of world are we co-designing? What kind of world would future generations inhabit? If we are thinking about arresting by AI and using AI within the criminal justice system, we've got to think about racial justice. We've got to think about social justice. And most of all, we've got to ensure that people's rights are not trampled upon. And we've got to ensure that communities that have been marginalized and victimized, communities of color, have got to be held up, have got to be supported, have got to be invested in. And we've got to ensure that we're not designing technologies to criminalize. We're not designing technologies to deny people a fair share of this life. And I want to thank you. And if you have any questions, please meet me in the speaker's lounge, or you can email me at Renee Cummings at columbia.edu, renee.cummings at columbia.edu. Thank you very much.